The Zareth's tentacles rippled nervously as he wrapped them around his 7th glass of Alara whiskey. In the dim light of Station Echo 9's infamous last stop bar, his bioluminescent spots pulsed with an uneasy rhythm that matched the thrumming of the station's ancient life support systems. The great gas giant Perseus loomed beyond the viewports, its storms casting strange shadows through the stale, smoke-filled air. Another, he gestured to the bartender, all 4 eyes fixed on the swirling liquid before him. The warrior caste markings on his mottled skin had long since faded, but the memories they carried were as sharp as ever. And keep them coming. The usual crowd of smugglers, miners, and deep space haulers had grown quiet, drawn in by the tension radiating from the alien veteran's corner. They'd seen his kind before, survivors of the human consortium war who carried more than just physical scars. But something was different tonight. The Zareth spots were cycling through warning colors, a sign of deep distress among his species. "You humans," he began suddenly, his voice carrying that distinctive rasp of someone who'd breathed too many exotic atmospheres. "You think you understand war because you've mastered its tools, your quantum weapons, your plasma rifles, your powered armor." He laughed, a harsh sound like grinding metal. "But you don't understand vengeance. Not like they do. Not like the Texas Knights." The name sent a ripple through the crowd. Even here, on the edge of known space, that name carried weight. "I see some of you shifting in your seats," the Zareth continued. "Good. You should be uncomfortable. I fought against them in 3 major campaigns during the war, led strike teams, infiltration units, even commanded a dreadnought in the Battle of New Austin. But it wasn't until I watched them hunt down my superior officer, 3 years after the peace treaties were signed, that I truly understood what makes them dangerous." He paused, his primary tentacles absently tracing the deep scar tissue that wrapped around his secondary limbs. "It's not their quantum spars that leave trails of blue fire across the battlefield. It's not their power armor, crafted by artisans who've spent generations perfecting their craft. It's not even those plasma-edged Bowie knives they're so fond of." Zara's upper eyes narrowed while his lower pair remained fixed on his drink. "It's their memory. Their unwavering, unrelenting, eternal memory." A burst of laughter from a nearby table made several patrons jump. The Zareth didn't even flinch. His spots had settled into a deep azure, the color of mourning among his kind. My commanding officer, Kex, never understood that. Even after years of fighting them, he never grasped what truly made the Knights different from other human warriors. He thought their strength lay in their weapons, their training, their technology. The alien's laugh was hollow. That ignorance cost him everything, including his life. And it all started with a sword. The word hung in the stale air like a quantum charge about to detonate. Even in an age of advanced weaponry, everyone knew about the Knight's swords. "Not just any sword," the Zareth continued, his voice dropping lower, forcing the crowd to lean in. "This was the ceremonial plasma blade of Master Sergeant James Wilson, the knight who held the Morgoth Gap alone during the final hours of the war. The one who saved 3 colony ships, 30,000 civilians, at the cost of his own life. But the war was over by then," someone in the crowd muttered. "Exactly." The Zareth's spots flashed crimson. The war was over. The treaties were signed. The Knight died in the final push. And Kex, his tentacles tightened around his glass until the duraplast creaked. That arrogant fool thought he'd claim himself a trophy of war. He drained his glass in a single smooth motion, then gestured for another. "Let me tell you about the last mistake my commanding officer ever made. Let me tell you what happens when you take a knight's sword. Because somewhere out there right now, they're hunting someone else, who hasn't learned this lesson. His spots shifted to display a pattern that humans couldn't quite follow, but made several other alien patrons flinch. The Knights have a saying, passed down since before they left old Earth. The eyes of Texas are upon you. Kex learned too late what that really means, and by the time this story is done, you'll understand why you never, ever touch a Texan sword. The Zareth's bioluminescent spots dimmed as the bartender brought another drink. Outside the viewport, Perseus had rotated enough to cast the bar in deep crimson shadows. The crowd had grown since he'd started his tale, with even the station's maintenance crews abandoning their posts to listen. You have to understand something about Texas Knights and their swords, he continued, his voice rougher than before. Each one is a story written in quantum-forged steel. The blade Kex took, it had passed through 15 generations of knights, each one adding their own modifications, their own battles, their own souls to its quantum matrix. He gestured at the bar's ancient duraplast counter. See these marks? Years of wear and tear, telling the story of every drink spilled, every fight fought, every deal made. A knight's sword is like that, but deeper, more personal. Each scratch, each modification, each power cell replacement, they're all recorded in the blade's memory. And the knights? They can read those memories like you humans read your ancient books. The Zareth's primary tentacles traced patterns in the condensation on his glass. I was there when Kex took it, final push of the war. The consortium had thrown everything we had at the Morgoth Gap, drone swarms, plasma batteries, even some weapons that violated the Geneva Accords. But Master Sergeant Wilson, he just wouldn't fall. His spots pulsed with remembered awe. You've never seen anything like it. One night, standing in that narrow pass between the colony ships and our entire assault force. His power armor was breached in 17 places. His quantum reserves were depleted. But that sword... The Zareth shuddered. That sword sang. Every swing left trails of blue fire in the void. Every strike cut through our best shielding like it was atmosphere. Where he finally fell, it wasn't to our weapons. His heart gave out. 15 generations of knights pushing that sword to its limits, and he used every last trace of power they'd stored in it. Saved those colonies, though. 30,000 civilians escaped, while he held the line. Zareth's lower eyes closed in what might have been respect. Our forces were in chaos after that. The humans had broken our lines in 3 other sectors, and the surrender order came through just hours later. In the confusion, Kex saw his chance. He led a reconnaissance mission to the battlefield, claimed he was documenting human weapon capabilities for the peace negotiations. A bitter laugh escaped him. I tried to stop him. Told him that some victories shouldn't be claimed, some trophies shouldn't be taken. But Kex, he was Old Guard Consortium, believed that strength was measured by what you could take from your enemies. The alien's spots shifted to a pattern that made several nearby patrons instinctively reach for their weapons. He didn't just take the sword. He had our technicians analyze it, tried to crack its quantum matrix. 15 generations of knight history, and he treated it like some piece of salvage to be stripped for parts. For 3 years he kept it hidden, moved from system to system, always one step ahead of the rumors, started calling himself a collector of military antiquities, even tried to sell the quantum matrix data to some Alara weapon developers. The Zareth's tentacles coiled tighter around his glass. I warned him. Told him what I'd seen the knights do during the war, how they never forgot a slight, never abandoned their own. But he just laughed. The war is over, he said. They're too busy rebuilding their precious Texas to care about one missing sword. His spots pulsed with a rhythm that suggested both fear and satisfaction. That's when I realized Kex had forgotten the most important lesson of the war. Texas nights don't measure time like the rest of us. Their memories don't fade with peace treaties or political boundaries. Zareth leaned forward, all four eyes scanning the crowd. Want to know how I know that? Because exactly 3 years, 2 months, and 14 days after Kex took that sword, 3 knights walked into his private museum on Proxima 7th. And by then, his spots flickered with a mix of guilt and vindication. By then, I'd already told them exactly where to find him. The Zareth's spots had settled into a steady pulse of deep indigo as he ordered another drink. The crowd in the last stop had grown so quiet you could hear the static discharge from the station's shield generators far below. "You want to know the funny thing about betrayal?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. "Sometimes it feels like justice." I'd spent 3 years watching Kex desecrate that sword, watching him try to crack its quantum matrix, attempting to steal 15 generations of Knight history. But what finally broke me? He tried to replicate it. His secondary tentacles twisted in what might have been discussed. Had a whole facility on Proxima 7, called it his private museum to anyone who asked, but in the sublevels, he had engineers trying to manufacture copies, cheap imitations of something sacred. That's when I made the call. The Zareth spots flickered with remembered tension. The Knights didn't come in force. No quantum lariat squadrons, no plasma rifle battalions. Just 3 of them. They landed at the Proxima 7th spaceport in a standard merchant hauler, wearing civilian clothes. But anyone who looked close enough could see it, that distinctive way they carry themselves, like gravity itself knows better than to mess with them. He gestured at the viewport where Perseus's storms were intensifying. It was a night just like this. Storm season on Proxima 7. Their acid rains were burning holes in the protective dome over Kex's compound. His security systems were top of the line. Motion sensors, quantum disruption fields, automated defense turrets. He had a small army of mercenaries on payroll, too. Veterans from 3 different wars who owed him favor. The alien's laugh was hollow. Didn't matter. The Knights walked through those defenses like they were morning mist. No weapons drawn, no shots fired. They just walked. 3 sets of powered armor, 3 Stetsons casting shadows in the storm light. The quantum spurs on their boots left trails of blue fire with each step, burning through the acid rain before it could touch them. His spots shifted to display colors that made several alien patrons look away. I watched it all through the security feeds. The mercenaries took one look at those Stetsons and stepped aside. The automated systems crashed the moment those spurs came within range. It was like watching gravity decide to flow upward. Everything we thought we knew about warfare and defense just stopped mattering. The Zareth's primary tentacles coiled tighter. They found Kex in his private vault. He had the sword mounted on the wall like some trophy, surrounded by other artifacts he'd collected over the years. When those Knights walked in, he tried to bargain, offered them credits, technology, information, anything to keep his prize. A pause as all 4 eyes focused on something distant. The Knights didn't say a word. The tallest one had to be a Wilson by the way he moved, just walked up to the sword, took it down with a reverence I'd never seen before. They spent 17 minutes cleaning it right there in the vault. Each movement was a ritual, each touch a prayer. His voice dropped lower. Then they turned to Kex. He had a disruptor pistol drawn, but his hands were shaking so bad he couldn't aim. The Wilson Knight just looked at him and said, "The eyes of Texas were upon you, partner." The Zareth drained his glass. It was quick, clean. More honor than he deserved, really. They gunned him down with conventional slug throwers, not plasma rifles or quantum weapons. An old-fashioned Texas execution for an old-fashioned crime. His spots pulsed with something between fear and admiration. 3 days later, I watched the news feeds. They had a ceremony on New Texas. The Wilson family was there, 15 generations of knights standing in formation as that sword came home. And you know what? The quantum matrix they'd been trying to crack for 3 years, turned out it had recorded everything. Every attempt to breach it, every moment of disrespect. The sword itself testified to its own desecration. The alien straightened slightly. The knights added that recording to their archives, a warning to anyone else who might think about touching something that doesn't belong to them. And me? His spots flickered uncertainly. They left me alive, said I'd learn the lesson Kex never did. Some traditions are sacred, no matter whose they are. His tentacles traced the warrior caste markings on his skin. But they also told me something else. Said that the eyes of Texas, they're always watching, always remembering. And I believe them. Because even now, 3 cycles later, sitting in this bar on the edge of known space, Zareth's voice trailed off as the bar's entrance hissed open, letting in a burst of recycled station air. His spots went completely dark, a defensive reaction his species had evolved over millennia of warfare. Around him, the crowd shifted uneasily, some reaching for concealed weapons, others looking for quick exits. Silhouetted in the doorway stood a figure that seemed to fill the entire frame. Power armor gleamed dully in the bar's dim light, its surface decorated with the kind of scars you only got from void combat. A Stetson cast shadows that somehow seemed darker than the space between stars, and quantum spurs hummed against the station's metal flooring with each deliberate step. The knight didn't look left or right, didn't acknowledge the way the crowd parted before them like an atmosphere breach had opened in their path. They walked with that distinctive grace that comes from generations of training, straight to the Zareth's table. The alien's tentacles were perfectly still now, showing the kind of control that only comes from years of military discipline. All 4 of his eyes remained fixed on his empty glass as the knight stopped before him. "Much obliged for sharing that story," the knight said, voice carrying that distinctive drawl of New Texas. The words seemed to fill the bar, though they were spoken barely above a whisper. "It's important that folks remember." Then leaning down close enough that only the Zareth could hear. "And thank you kindly for that tip about Kex's other collection on Napit. The recovery teams found 3 more knight relics in that vault yesterday. The Martinez family especially appreciated getting their grandfather's quantum lariat back." The Zareth spots flickered once, a pattern that translated roughly to "acknowledged" in the old consortium battle language. The knight straightened up, adjusted their Stetson with a practiced motion, and turned to leave. But at the doorway they paused. "Oh, and Zareth?" The words carried clearly across the now silent bar. "The Wilson family asked me to pass along a message. They say your debt is paid in full. Your children's children can walk free of your war crimes now. The eyes of Texas will remember your service." The door hissed shut behind the knight, leaving the bar in a silence deep enough to hear the quantum generators thrumming 17 decks below. The Zareth spots slowly resumed their normal patterns, though several patrons noticed they were displaying colors they'd never seen before. "Like I said," the alien finally spoke, his voice rough with emotion that didn't translate well to human ears. "They never forget. Not betrayal." His tentacles wrapped around one final glass of Alara whiskey. "And not redemption either." He lifted the glass in what might have been a toast. "To Texas Knights, the only humans who understood that sometimes the greatest victory isn't in winning the war. His spots pulsed one final time, displaying the color of dawn on his homeworld. But in making peace with your enemies. Around him, the crowd gradually dispersed, each being left with the distinct impression that they'd witnessed something both terrible and profound. The story would spread as such stories do, from bar to bar, station to station, until it became another legend in the growing mythology of the Texas Nights. And somewhere out in the void between stars, quantum spurs continued to burn their blue fire across the darkness as the Nights carried on their eternal vigil. For the eyes of Texas, as every spacer now knew, were always watching, always remembering, and always, always keeping their word. The eyes of Texas are upon you all the livelong day. The eyes of Texas are upon you. You cannot get away. Do not think you can escape them. From night till early in the morn, the eyes of Texas are upon you till Gabriel blows his horn. End of poem. This recording is in the public domain. For more from Gabriel, please visit LibriVox.org. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it a lot. If you did, please be sure to give it a like. Feel free to comment and share this story too. It helps the channel grow. Let's make this channel huge together.